Hi. So I'm Nico. I'm one of the front-end engineers at Plum Guide, and this is my colleague Tiago, who's the tech lead, or one of the tech leads. So our presentation, as you can tell by the title, is all about how we have reacted to growth. So we're going to be talking about how we are using React to modernize and scale the front-end architecture. So just to give you guys a bit of a background as to who we are at Plum Guide. So we launched in 2015 as a booking platform for the best homes on the planet. Unlike other platforms that you may know of, all of our homes have been thoroughly tested through a mix of human selection, but also through grading algorithms as well. We're still a fairly new startup, but we now cover 12 different cities across the globe, and our goal is to launch in many more next year. We recently raised 40 million in a Series B funding round, and as part of that, we've been scaling all aspects of Plum, but at the moment there's a really big focus on engineering. So in terms of engineering, we've pretty much gone through two major stages of evolution so far, and we're just starting on the third. So what we'd like to do is just dive into each of those stages and talk about how we've used React in each. So in terms of the initial stack, Plum started, as many startups do, by building an MVP that got the company off the ground. But this very quickly grew in size and complexity as we started moving into more cities and we started hiring more people. Plum was built as an ASP.NET MVC application, so using Razor views, and it's very much dependent on the Windows platform. For those who are not familiar with ASP.NET, it's very similar to Rails apps with views, or Laravel. I pronounced it wrong earlier. Laravel for PHP. As with most websites, you probably recognize a couple of those things there. At the time, Bootstrap was pretty big, jQuery as well, so obviously using that to enrich the content on this site. So as a startup, naturally there were some growing pains. As I've mentioned, there was a high level of complexity which made it a lot harder to maintain the application, so things were getting much more difficult to work with. We also had low code coverage, which, as you know, is probably quite bad for business. So test cases were churning at a very high rate. Build times were increasing, obviously because of the complexity of the application, so that ultimately slowed down the deployment pipeline, which meant that our development speed was much slower than where we wanted it to be. Because we're using the MVC framework as well, it was quite difficult to build reusable code and reusable components. So with that in mind, we began focusing on the future of Plum. So some of our core goals that we wanted to tackle were modernizing the stack. So that was ultimately improving the developer experience, which meant that we can get features out much, much quicker. We also wanted to create features in more leaner, easily testable and isolated environments. But we also wanted to move away from the monolithic model that we had. But we had to do this incrementally. We had to do this piece by piece, as it just doesn't quite make sense to rewrite the entire application. So at this point, I'm actually going to hand over to Tiago, who's going to go over in more detail as to how we achieve this in practice.
So the first thing we did was what we call the Hybrid Manoeuvre. What this means for us is that around the time that we're using jQuery, the browsers became a bit more consistent. There was less JavaScript errors, so we kind of sunsetted jQuery with time. We stick with it Pure.js, ES6, the most basic thing you can do. And then we just limited the Razor views, which is the server-side templating stuff, to just critical server-side rendering. The next thing we did was evaluate how we build the client side, and React really came out for us, mostly because React is really, really good at just hooking up into small specific parts of the DOM and the page, and you can easily offer progressive enhancement with React. We did that, and I'm going to show a little bit how we did in practice. So this is our homepage. It's been like that for quite a while, actually. Initially, it was all server-side templating language. I can show the code. A lot of jQuery, a lot of Bootstrap that eventually became really teamed out because of the brand. So it's really hard to maintain these pages after a while, and it becomes really cumbersome, especially when there's more engineers involved. It becomes really hard not to step on each other's toes. So what we did was actually ended up like this. So we left the server-side rendering alone for now. We keep it as is, we don't touch it. And then we focus on the bottom, on the below the fold content as it is. And if you look at the top bit, there's actually much less code now. All it does is actually Just moving next. There's like a React homepage thing with homepage div, and there's some placeholder elements I usually use like for gray, this kind of effects that you normally see on Facebook while it's loading. And then the bottom bit, there's now a new script tag that points to our bundle. And then the bundle React just kicks in. As you can see, it just looks at the React homepage, hooks up into that div elements, and just like everything takes over. And that's kind of how you mix and match and kind of slowly migrate to React, or kind of slice stuff apart. Apart. So yeah, that worked really well for us, and we started to kind of try to build on that, and then we continue investing in React. So what we did next bit was move that React into something more composable, more componentized, because like Nico said, we're kind of tied to Windows platform at the time. We're trying to find a way to slowly move out of it. So React is really good again at this. So I don't know if you heard of Storybook, but Storybook is kind of like a way for you to develop in a sandbox environment where you can actually play around with stuff, and kind of actually like a real life React environment. So what we did was started building blocks of our brand on these React environments. And right after that, we could just immediately start developing UI and components without being tied to Windows. We could run this anywhere. It's like amazing development experience compared to Razor. There's like hot mod reloading. There's like much better error handling and much easier to test. So that was much nicer for us. Yeah, more the same. So this is kind of the same example, but on the search page. So the search page again was like lots of Razor View, lots of jQuery, especially around the top bit where there's like the search filters. So when the forms come to involved, it becomes even harder to manage all these things. So again, it's a very small snippet, but the real thing was actually much bigger. And you could make this work. You could start, refactoring this, but it was really, really hard. So we kind of like started slicing stuff out, and React came to help us. So at some point, we tried to enhance the search experience by putting a map, like you usually expect on this kind of experiences. So when I put like you can barely see it, but there's like a map on the side. You can drag around and search for it. There's like some markers to see the prices. So we definitely wanted to build these with better tools, and React was one of those. So this is what we end up with. So again, we don't touch the top bit. We leave it alone for SEO especially. And what we do is actually slice the stuff out, and we leave nothing but the placeholders. So if you see the top bit, there's like React search, which actually indicates developers that there's React hooking into that div. And then at the top bit, there's like a script tag that just points to our bundle. And then from there on, we can just develop everything inside the React world. And most of these components just come from actually Plum UI at this point, or like our component library. Cool. Another thing worth of note is how they can communicate. So if you look at the top bit, there's actually the searches in there, and at some point the React world actually has to know about how the filters change so they can update the state. So what we found an easy way for us to do this actually was to use custom events. So if you use custom events, you can actually easily communicate between the two bridges. Custom events are part of the DOM native API, so it's very easy to use, it's very light touch. And all you do, and if you change the filters up there, is that you just fire in a custom event, and then over there, there's someone listening to it and just dispatches an action over to Redux, which then takes over, and there's API calls and everything else. So it's very easy for us to kind of communicate between those worlds like this. Yeah, I've got a video cannot be loaded.
Oh, no, what?
Okay. Well, imagine there's a video here, and it'll play and show you how it goes. So yeah, if you go to our search page, you'll be able to see this in action. So you see like the gray stuff coming out, but like you see on Facebook, and then React takes over, and you can't even see the deterioration in user experience because you can't even tell that it's Razor and React on the same page. It's actually quite seamless, but it's all back. So we'll move on. So the cons for this. The cons for this is there's still not a great developer experience because even though you're developing the stuff in Storybook, you have to bring everything over into the monolith and kind of test everything together. So you still have to run the windows, you still have to run the entire web server to test the stuff. So it's still not massively amazing. It still requires you to maintain two rendering technologies. So you have to maintain React, so you have to maintain Razor. It's a bit tricky. And you also now have slightly longer deployment times because now you're just building the old stuff and also the new stuff. So you have to run npm, run builds on a CI, which takes like an extra minute or two at least. And then again, the interpretability of like using custom events, which is not a big deal, but still. The pros of this, of course, was that it's much better component isolation, so the stuff built in React was much nicer, it was much, much easier to test. It was, with help of Storybook, we could think about reusability, about scaling our teams. It was much faster development speed, so if you've used React, you know how it works. It's insanely fast to have like the feedback cycle between developers and designers. And now we start pushing into the cross-platform world, so now like kind of staying away from like being tied to Windows, essentially. The next iteration of that, of course, is like putting React everywhere, basically. So it was server-side rendering. So what we did was we started by making the components server-side friendly. So when you render like all the stuff, they kind of fall back to nice gray stuff if you're not rendering on the node environments. We improved our APIs on the back end as well, so that we could do initial state injection and kind of play around with the environments, make it work nicely. And then we kind of agreed to like stop building with Razor, and just any new page that we build, we go straight for everything in React because it worked well so for us. And this is what you see here. So at some point around 8 months ago, we wanted to build some new landing pages. They were kind of optimized landing pages for PPC traffic. We went straight into React everything. So what you get here is actually all React, front end and the back. So the same components that you saw on the search page are the same here. So we didn't have to rebuild anything. We just pulled them in, came to the page, and everything worked out. So if you go to plumguy.com/London Apartments, you actually get served a Node.js application that comes from that renders both React on both ends, the back and the front. What this works, because they're still on the same website, what works now is that if you go to plumguy.com and you hit like the root app, you get a C# server giving you Razor, and then React on the front end. That arrow is wrong, but on React on the front end, it gives you like the Plum UI components. What happens now if you go to this page is that if you go to /London or Paris or any other city they were in /something else, you get the Node.js server serving you React. So we kind of sliced up our infrastructure in two by using like a reverse proxy, something like Nginx or something else. Again, we maintain, because they're two code bases, we kind of maintain consistency by using component libraries. In this case, Plum UI. And again, because the code is smaller and is much easier to test, it's actually much easier to deploy. And if something fails, or if you push bad code into the new landing pages, it actually doesn't affect the monolith and vice versa. So they're much more resilient like this. Cool. So it kind of gives us like the final iteration of where we are right now, which is what we call vertical micro frontends. What this means is that we actually use a reverse proxying to split the routes to multiple apps, depending on like rules. Like it could be URL, could be headers, could be really anything like cookies, but in this case, mostly rules. We can actually choose the right model for each app. So depending on which parts of the experience you're getting, you could be serving a single server-side running application. You could actually be getting a create track app application like a spa, or it could be something else. It doesn't really matter. And they're independent apps as well. So it's smaller code bases. They're used by different teams. They have much smaller deployment times because they're much easier to maintain. There's less code on them. There's better resilience. So it's very, very nice kind of model. And of course, you maintain the consistency by using the code with component libraries that React is so good at doing. Again, the major benefits of this is that the teams now have much stronger ownership and independence, so they own the entire verticality of what they're working on. If they push out by code, they don't affect the other teams, so it doesn't break anything on the other parts of the site. There's smaller code for them to handle. There's less chances of them bumping it into each other. There's faster development cycles, so it's a much nicer way of breaking our massive website into smaller things. And also it incentivizes exploration. So if you want to try something new, something different, we can actually just make a new route, even like /test, and you can put something else completely different in there, and you can see a nice experience without breaking anything else. So after a few months, we kind of look like this. So at some point, the host team wanted to build a new onboarding experience for our hosts. It's behind the login screen, so there's an SEO. So the easiest thing to do was just using a React spa, so a single page application. It was like, there's an Nginx and an S3 bucket serving that page. If you go to plumguy.com/host onboarding, you get this page, and it's completely isolated from everything else, and all they do is pull in components from Storybook and Plum UI. Again, if you were to scale again, hypothetically, we're kind of working on this, not officially yet, but still, we have the journal, plumguy.com. If you go to a new team joins in, starts working the journal, everyone loves Gatsby nowadays, so they could actually use Gatsby on plumguy.com/journal. They would just maintain the consistency by using Storybook and Plum UI. So again, if they fuck up something at the journal, we can actually, doesn't break anything else but the journal, so none of the teams get affected by broken code. If you've seen micro frontends on the web, if you kind of Google for them, you probably end up looking at this image. This is what is called like compositional micro frontends. This is a different model, so it's when you're on the same page, you actually on the same page you slice the buttons, so they come from different teams, different libraries, different everything. This works if you kind of have like a massive single page application, like a web player or like a Spotify app where you just have a single page. But for us, because the app is like very navigational, it's slicing them vertically makes more sense, because usually like teams like the search team is working on a search experience, the checkout team is working on a checkout experience, so it makes much more sense than this kind of model. So there are different models of doing it. None of them is wrong, but it makes depending on what kind of architecture do you have on your application. Yeah, so this was repeated. Cool. Yeah. So this kind of where we are right now is we've kind of been slicing away, literally slicing away our monolith. We've been expanding our teams also in slices, and it's been really working well so far. And at the center of it has been reusability through component libraries and shareable code, which React really shines at. And of course, it's not without its challenges, but it's been really a really nice way and safe way to break our monolith apart. We've learned some interesting stuff along the way. We've got some challenges, and Nico's going to talk about it.
Cool. Yeah, so these are just some of the things that we would like to share, some of the tips when it comes to evolving your code base. So one of the first things you should try and do is identify your biggest bottlenecks and your pain points. So these could be things that are slowing you down as a developer. It could be things that are slowing down the application, and it could also be things that are just increasing your tech debt, because everybody hates tech debt. Another point is that you want to settle on a solution as a team. So you want to have team discussions, you want to be talking about new things. Like Tiago was saying, we're investigating using Gatsby for the journal. We're doing that as a team. We're trying to make sure it's the right solution. And we think that's definitely the right way to do it, getting the whole team involved. Again, you should try and make a plan to tackle everything progressively and then avoid big rewrites. You don't want to rewrite your entire application. It's going to take a long time. So another point I want to basically add is that it's an absolute must that your product has to evolve over time. This is so that you can deliver the most value to not only the business, but to your customers, your clients, whoever, and just provide the best user experience. Pretty obvious, but obviously the longer you leave stuff like tech debt, the longer you don't tackle those problems, much harder it is to migrate away. I've had bad experience with that in the past, but we're evolving really quickly here at Plum. So a fairly obvious point, legacy code bases don't disappear overnight. So as we keep saying, we're evolving very rapidly, but we've still got parts of the application that are still in stage 0 pretty much, or stage 1, should I say. So don't try and migrate your entire code base at once. You should try and break things down into much smaller chunks. So as we said here, slice your salami. I didn't realize this was actually a term, but salami slicing is actually a term. So it's essentially exploring ways to slice your problem into much smaller chunks, and that's a good way to deal with it. So things like new features and functionality is like prime time to start exploring new ideas, exploring new technologies. And as we're saying, migrating away from the monolith to things like microservices, micro front ends. It may not always be the right time, but as long as you're planning far enough in the future, eventually you'll get to that point. As you're saying, if you manage your tech debt well, you can move rapidly as a team, but still deliver value to the business. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that I joined Plum at a very exciting time. Obviously, we're just getting started on some really exciting stuff. I've only been here for a month, but everything that we've talked about today in this talk is what got me excited about joining Plum in the first place. If you're as excited as I am and you like some of the stuff that we talked about, definitely head to our careers page. We'd love to talk to you. But yeah, that pretty much wraps up our talk. So we hope that you found this inspirational or useful. And of course, if you've got any questions for us, then let us know. Otherwise, we'll be mingling around, having a couple of beers. And yeah, we'd just like to say thank you for hosting us.